The date is May 25th, 1953. The location is Frenchman Flat, a dry, sun-baked lake bed within the Nevada test site. From the perspective of a distant observer, the desert morning seems indistinguishable from any other. The heat haze is already rising off the hardpan floor. The silence is absolute, save for the wind hissing through the scrub brush. But this silence is a deception. In the bunkers and observation posts scattered miles away, men are holding their breath, counting down seconds to an event that physics suggests should be impossible in this specific configuration. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the horizon dissolves. A flash of light, brighter than the sun at its zenith, bleaches the color out of the world. It is a blinding, searing white that penetrates even tightly shut eyelids. For a fraction of a second, the shadows of the Joshua trees are burned into the ground. Then comes the heat, a thermal pulse that feels like a furnace door swinging open against the skin, even from miles away. And finally, the sound. A crack so violent it feels less like a noise and more like a physical blow to the chest, followed by the rolling, thunderous roar of the atmosphere tearing itself apart. A mushroom cloud begins to climb into the stratosphere, churning with violet and orange fire, dragging a column of dust and debris thousands of feet into the air. It is the unmistakable, terrifying signature of the atomic age. The yield is 15 kilotons, roughly the same destructive power that leveled Hiroshima 8 years prior. But to the Soviet intelligence apparatus, which monitors these seismic events and atmospheric disturbances with paranoid intensity, something about this detonation does not make sense. The yield is standard, the location is known, the enemy is familiar, but the method of delivery is a ghost. There was no high-altitude bomber drone, there was no heavy strategic aircraft screaming overhead. There was no massive missile plume like the V-2 rockets the Soviets had studied after the fall of Berlin. The radar screens were effectively empty of heavy delivery vehicles. According to the data filtering back to Moscow, a nuclear sun had simply appeared on the battlefield, seemingly out of nowhere. It had arrived with the speed, the trajectory, and the low profile of a standard artillery shell. This was the incident. And for the strategists in the Kremlin, it was not just a test. It was a mathematical impossibility that threatened to rewrite the laws of war. If you want to uncover the hidden technologies and secret histories that defined the Cold War, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We document the machinery and the madness of the superpower conflict. Now, let's return to the mystery. The immediate aftermath of the detonation sent ripples of confusion through the Soviet military hierarchy. In 1953, the Soviet Union was in a precarious position. Joseph Stalin had died only 2 months earlier, in March. The power vacuum in Moscow was intense, with Georgy Malenkov and Nikita Khrushchev vying for control. The one thing keeping the Soviet Union secure was the sheer, overwhelming mass of the Red Army. The Soviet military doctrine of the 1950s was built on a single, terrifying premise: the deep battle. They knew they could not match the United States in economic output, or, at that exact moment, in the precision of their strategic bombing. So, they compensated with armor. The Soviet Union was building a force of T-54 tanks and T-55 tanks that would number in the tens of thousands. Their plan for a war in Europe was a tidal wave of steel. They would punch through the Fulda Gap in West Germany, flooding the plains with so many armored divisions that the NATO forces would simply be overrun by weight of numbers. The American response to this was expected to be strategic. The Soviets believed the Americans would have to fly heavy bombers like the B-29 or the B-36 from bases in England or the United States to drop nuclear weapons on Soviet cities or massive troop concentrations. These bombers could be tracked. They could be intercepted by MiG-15 aircraft. They could be shot down by anti-aircraft fire. There was a window of time, hours, between the launch of a bomber and the detonation of a weapon. But the data from Frenchman Flat on that May morning suggested that the window of time had been erased. If the Americans had found a way to deliver a 15-kiloton warhead without a plane, if they could deliver it instantly, tactically, right on the front line, then the Soviet advantage in tank numbers was instantly rendered obsolete. Imagine a Soviet tank battalion, 50 armored vehicles moving in tight formation across a German field. In the old world, they are invincible against conventional gunfire. But if this new phantom weapon exists, a single projectile, fired from a hidden position 10 miles away, could vaporize the entire battalion in a microsecond. No warning, no radar blip, just a whistle in the air, and then oblivion. The confusion in Moscow quickly curdled into a cold, hard dread. Intelligence analysts began looking for the source. Was it a new type of invisible missile? Had the Americans developed a guided rocket small enough to be fired from a truck but powerful enough to carry a physics package? The implications were catastrophic. The Soviet defensive strategy relied on the idea that nuclear weapons were strategic, massive devices used to end wars, not tactical devices used to fight battles. If the line between a bullet and an atomic bomb was blurring, the Red Army was walking into a trap. Reports began to circulate in the upper echelons of the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. They spoke of a flash that originated from ground level. Some speculated it was a landmine, pre-planted. Others feared it was a suicide weapon. But the most terrifying theory was the one that seemed the least likely, that the Americans had done the impossible. They had shrunk the apocalypse. They had taken the most complex, heavy, and delicate piece of machinery in human history, the atomic bomb, and turned it into a piece of ammunition. But the physics didn't make sense to the Soviet scientists. A nuclear weapon requires precise geometry. The lenses of explosive inside the bomb must detonate at the exact same nanosecond to compress the plutonium core. If you fire that bomb out of a gun, the G-force is thousands of times the force of gravity should crush the delicate electronics and warp the explosives. The bomb should be a dud. Or worse, it should detonate inside the barrel, killing the crew. It was an engineering paradox. You cannot shoot a scientific laboratory out of a cannon. And yet the seismic sensors did not lie. The radiation detectors did not lie. Something had detonated in the Nevada desert. The Kremlin needed answers. They needed to know what had made that mushroom cloud, and more importantly, they needed to know if it was coming to Europe. The investigation began in earnest, driven by a fear that the balance of power had just shifted violently in favor of the West. The hunt for the atomic cannon had begun, though at this stage they did not even have a name for the monster they were looking for. They only knew that the Americans had unlocked a door that should have remained shut. The silence inside the walls of the Kremlin was heavier than usual. It was a silence born of a frantic, desperate noise that was happening behind closed doors. In the weeks following the seismic event in Nevada, the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the GRU, was running at redline capacity. General staff officers, men who had commanded armies that crushed the Wehrmacht, stood over large tactical maps of Central Europe, their faces pale. They were staring at the Fulda Gap, the lowland corridors in West Germany, where a potential World War III would be decided. For years, they had looked at this terrain with confidence. It was tank country. It was ground made for the T-54 tanks and the heavy IS-3 tanks to maneuver in mass formations. But now, the map looked different. It looked like a graveyard. The investigation into the American Phantom weapon began not with a photograph, but with physics. Soviet nuclear scientists were summoned from the secret cities, places like Artemis 1-6, to explain the data coming out of America. They were presented with the impossible paradox, a nuclear detonation that occurred without an aircraft delivery system, with the seismic signature of a ground impact, yet with the yield of a strategic bomb. The scientists were skeptical. In 1953, the Soviet nuclear program was advanced, but it was struggling with miniaturization. Their own bombs were massive, heavy spheres of metal and explosive lenses, weighing thousands of pounds. To detonate a nuclear core, you need a perfect sphere of conventional explosives to squeeze a plutonium pit into a critical mass. This implosion requires delicate detonators, precise wiring and firing circuits that must operate within nanoseconds of each other. If you were to place such a device inside an artillery shell and fire it, the acceleration alone would destroy it. A shell, leaving a cannon barrel, experiences setback forces of 10,000 Gs. That is 10,000 times the force of gravity. It is enough force to turn solid metal into jelly. It is certainly enough force to smash the delicate vacuum tubes and wiring of a 1950s atomic bomb into useless scrap. Therefore, the initial conclusion of the Soviet investigation was dangerous but comforting. The Americans were lying. A report circulated through the Ministry of Defense, suggesting that the Nevada test was a masquerade. Perhaps the Americans had buried a bomb in the desert beforehand and simply detonated it to coincide with an artillery volley, creating the illusion of a nuclear shell. It was a psychological operation, a bluff designed to scare the Soviet Union into backing down in Europe. But the intelligence from human assets told a different story. There was chatter in Washington. There were whispers in the chaotic corridors of the Pentagon about a 280mm solution. There were procurement orders for heavy forging capability that didn't match any known naval gun or tank barrel. The paranoia began to set in. If it wasn't a bluff, what was it? The investigation turned to alternative theories. The rocket theory gained traction among Soviet air defense experts. They theorized that the Americans had developed a short-range ballistic missile similar to the Soviet FROG, free rocket over ground, systems that were in development, but with an invisible guidance system. They pored over radar logs, looking for high-angle trajectories that would indicate a missile. They found nothing. The radar profile of the projectile in Nevada was flat, fast, and low. It was a bullet, not a rocket. This led to the supergun theory, which terrified the tank commanders the most. If the Americans had truly hardened a nuclear warhead to survive the violence of being fired from a gun, they had achieved a level of material science that the Soviet Union could not replicate. It meant the Americans possessed shock-hardened electronics and explosive lenses that were immune to G-force. The Soviet military began to hallucinate enemies. Every American artillery piece in West Germany became a potential nuclear launcher. A standard 155mm howitzer? Could that be nuclear? A battalion of M115 heavy howitzers? Were they hiding atomic shells in their caissons? The psychological impact was devastating. The Red Army's entire doctrine was based on mass. You concentrate your forces to break through enemy lines. But against an enemy with tactical nuclear artillery, concentration is a death sentence. If you group your tanks together, you present a juicy target for a single atomic shell. If you spread your tanks out to avoid the nuke, you lose your breakthrough power and get picked off by conventional anti-tank weapons. It was a tactical checkmate. The investigators grew desperate. They combed through open-source American newspapers, looking for slips. In the 1950s, the American press was surprisingly open, but the specific mechanism of the weapon remained shrouded in mystery. They saw references to Atomic Annie, a nickname that sounded innocuous, almost cute. But the capabilities attributed to this Annie were monstrous. Reports suggested a range of 20 miles. 20 miles! That meant an American battery could sit comfortably behind their own lines, well out of sight, and drop a Hiroshima-sized explosion on a Soviet forward operating base, a rail junction, or a tank column. The Soviets tried to model the weapon. They drew sketches of what such a gun must look like. To fire a shell large enough to hold a nuclear core, even a miniaturized one, the gun would have to be enormous. It would need to be a battleship gun on wheels. But surely, such a thing would be impossible to move. It would sink into the mud of Europe. It would be a sitting duck for Soviet MiG-15 aircraft. They convinced themselves that the weapon must be a static emplacement, a defensive turret buried in the hills of Bavaria. They looked for construction sites, huge concrete pours that would indicate a fixed gun. They found none. The mystery deepened. The weapon was powerful enough to wipe out a division, small enough to hide from radar, yet apparently mobile enough to not require a fixed base. By the end of 1953, the investigation had produced no concrete hardware to show the Politburo. They had no blueprints. They had no stolen manuals. All they had was a growing pile of circumstantial evidence that the United States had solved the physics problem of artillery, delivered nukes. The fear began to curdle into irrationality. Soviet commanders demanded their own atomic bullets. They demanded that their scientists build a gun to match the Americans, but the Soviet scientists pushed back. "We cannot shrink the warhead yet," they argued. "We need 5 more years." "We do not have 5 years," was the screaming response from the generals. The Kremlin began to view the Western Front not as a battlefield, but as a trap. They imagined American artillery crews, relaxed and chewing gum, loading shells that cost millions of dollars into breaches, ready to incinerate the pride of the Soviet Union with the pull of a lanyard. The bogeyman was real. It was out there. But the Soviets were looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for a miracle of electronics, a subtle, high-tech solution to the problem of nuclear artillery. They didn't realize that the American solution wasn't about subtlety. It wasn't about a new, sci-fi electronic trigger. The American solution was a triumph of brute force engineering and a throwback to a terrifyingly simple design that the Soviets had dismissed as obsolete. While the KGB hunted for microchips and guidance systems, the Americans were building a dinosaur. A dinosaur that roared with the power of the Sunday, The investigation was running in circles, chasing ghosts of advanced rocketry, while the real monster was being loaded onto a train car in the United States, destined for the forests of Germany. While the Kremlin saw ghosts and the Soviet General Staff chased theories of invisible missiles, the truth was sitting in plain sight, inside a massive industrial hangar at the Watervliet Arsenal in New York and the Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey. The American solution to the impossible physics of nuclear artillery was not a delicate piece of sci-fi wizardry. It was 85 tons of hardened steel, chrome, and intimidation. The project had begun in 1949, driven by a single, terrifying strategic gap. The Pentagon knew that the Soviet Union had more men, more tanks, and shorter supply lines in Europe. If the Cold War turned hot, the Red Army would swarm across the border like locusts. The United States needed an equalizer. They needed a way to bring the apocalyptic power of the atomic bomb down from the stratosphere and place it directly into the hands of a ground commander. But the engineers faced the exact same problem that baffled the Soviet scientists. How do you keep an atomic bomb from breaking when you shoot it out of a cannon? The breakthrough came from a decision to look backward, not forward. The Soviets were obsessed with implosion devices, the complex spheres of explosives used in the Nagasaki bomb, and the Soviets' own RDS-1. These devices were efficient, but they were fragile. They were like Swiss watches. You could not shoot a Swiss watch out of a howitzer and expect it to tick. So, the American engineers at Los Alamos and the Ordnance Corps took a different path. They went back to the design of the Little Boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This was a gun-type uranium device. It was simpler, cruder, and far less efficient than implosion, but it had one massive advantage. It was rugged. A gun-type bomb works by shooting a bullet of uranium into a target ring of uranium inside the bomb casing. When they slam together, they reach critical mass and explode. It was essentially a gun barrel inside a bomb. The American genius was to realize that because this design was solid metal, it could withstand the violent acceleration of being fired. They didn't need delicate electronics or complex explosive lenses. They just needed to harden the casing. They created the W9 warhead. It was 11 inches wide or 280 millimeters. It was a sleek, aerodynamic shell that looked like an oversized conventional artillery round, but inside, it carried the power of 15,000 tons of TNT. But having the shell was only half the battle. They needed a gun to fire it. And this is where the American project shifted from scientific ingenuity to industrial brutality. To throw a shell that weighed 800 pounds over a distance of 20 miles with pinpoint accuracy, you couldn't use a standard field gun. You needed a monster. The result was the M65. It was the largest mobile artillery piece ever built by the United States. In the design phase, the engineers looked at the massive railway guns used by the Nazis in World War II, specifically the K5 Anzio Anni that had terrorized Allied troops in Italy. They took that concept and revolutionized it. The M65 was not a fixed weapon, it was fully mobile. This was the impossible feature the Soviets couldn't grasp. The cannon itself was 84 feet long. The barrel alone weighed nearly 50 tons. When fully assembled for travel, the entire rig was longer than a blue whale. It was so heavy that it required two specially designed Kenworth tractors to move it, one at the front to pull and one at the rear to push and steer, connected by a complex system of hydraulics and intercoms. The drivers had to coordinate their movements with telepathic precision to navigate the narrow roads of the German countryside. It looked like something from a fever dream, a prehistoric beast made of olive-drab steel. When the M65 was on the move, it could reach speeds of 35 miles per hour. This doesn't sound fast, but for a weapon of mass destruction, it was lightning. It meant the atomic cannon could be parked in a forest in Bavaria, fire a nuclear shell, and be packed up and moving to a new location before the mushroom cloud had even fully risen. The engineering was a masterclass in American dominance. The carriage featured a turntable that allowed the gun to traverse 360 degrees. The recoil system was a marvel of hydraulics that absorbed the violence of the shot so effectively that the gun barely moved on its base. But the true genius was the psychological impact. The M65 wasn't designed to be hidden. It wasn't a stealth weapon. It was designed to be seen. It was a show of force. The Americans were betting that the mere existence of this weapon would freeze the Soviet tank armies in their tracks. In May 1953, the moment of truth arrived. The test at Frenchman Flat, the one that the Soviets had detected, was the final proof of concept. The M65, nicknamed Atomic Annie by the troops, was rolled out onto the desert floor. The crew, wearing standard combat fatigues, loaded the W9 shell into the breach. There were no scientists in lab coats hovering over them. These were artillerymen doing their job. When the order to fire was given, Atomic Annie roared. The ground shook. The shell screamed downrange for 19 seconds before detonating with perfect precision over the target area. It worked. The Americans had successfully turned the atomic bomb into a piece of standard ammunition. While the Soviet KGB was still writing reports about invisible missiles, the United States Army was already printing training manuals for the M65. They were painting the massive barrels. They were training the drivers on how to take tight corners in German villages. The weapon was real. It was ready. And it was about to be shipped to Europe. The Soviets were right to be terrified, but they were wrong about the nature of the threat. They thought they were facing a new kind of science. Instead, they were facing the ultimate expression of American industrial might, a gun so big, so powerful, and so audacious that it rendered the concept of tank warfare obsolete in a single trigger pull. The Americans had bridged the gap. They didn't need more tanks. They had a gun that could eat tank battalions for breakfast. But the real shock was yet to come. The Soviets were still in the dark about the specific machine. They knew something had happened, but they had not yet looked the monster in the eye. That confrontation was approaching fast. The M65 was crossing the Atlantic, and when it arrived in West Germany, it would cause a crisis that would shake the Kremlin to its foundations. The mystery did not end in a dark interrogation room or a secret laboratory. It ended on a public street in West Germany. In late 1953, the rumors of phantom explosions and invisible missiles were silenced by a spectacle so loud and so physically massive that it could not be ignored. The United States Army decided that secrecy was no longer the strategy. Intimidation was the strategy. They rolled the M65 cannon out into the open. For the Soviet GRU agents stationed in West Germany, disguised as civilians or watching from unmarked cars, the sight was a psychological hammer blow. They were expecting a truck with a rocket on the back. Instead, they saw the ground trembling. Around the corner came the lead tractor, a specialized Kenworth roaring with diesel power. Then came the carriage, a complex web of girders and hydraulics. And then, the barrel. It seemed to go on forever. A smooth black steel tube, 84 feet long, suspended between the two massive tractors. This was the reveal. The moment the ghost became flesh, the reports went back to Moscow immediately, and the tone changed from confusion to shock. "It is a gun," the messages read. "It is a 280mm cannon." The implications of this physical reality were horrifying for the Soviet High Command. If it was a missile, it could be jammed, it could be shot down. But a cannon shell? It is a dumb object. It follows a ballistic arc. You cannot jam gravity. You cannot intercept a supersonic block of steel. Once the Americans pulled the lanyard, the city, the base, or the tank division at the other end of the arc was already dead. There was no defense. But the true shock wasn't just the weapon itself. It was the deployment. The Americans didn't just build one Atomic Annie, they built 20 of them. They shipped them to Europe and Korea. They were seen navigating the autobahns. They were seen practicing in the forests. The Soviets realized that the Americans had integrated nuclear weapons into their standard order of battle. The nuclear taboo, the idea that atomic weapons were a last resort, had been shattered. The Americans were signaling that they would use nukes just as casually as they used hand grenades. The Soviet reaction was pure, unadulterated panic. The Politburo demanded parity. Nikita Khrushchev, who would soon consolidate power, was obsessed with missiles. But the army generals demanded a gun. They could not allow the Americans to be the only ones with an atomic cannon. It was a matter of national prestige and tactical survival. And this is where the story shifts from American dominance to Soviet desperation. The Soviet engineers were ordered to build an answer to Atomic Annie immediately. They were told to build a mobile cannon capable of firing a nuclear shell. But they ran into the physics wall that the Americans had cleverly sidestepped. The Soviets still did not have a gun-type nuclear device, rugged enough to fit in a 280mm shell. Their smallest nuclear package was a massive implosion device, requiring a huge sphere of explosives. So, to fit the bomb, they had to build a bigger gun, a much, much bigger gun. The result was the 2A, 3 condensator, 2P. If Atomic Annie was a dinosaur, the condensator was a monster from a different dimension. It was unveiled in a Red Square parade in 1957 to gasps from Western observers. It carried a colossal 406mm barrel. It was mounted on the chassis of a T-10 heavy tank. It looked terrifying. It looked like the Soviet Union had one-upped the Americans. But it was a lie. While the American M65 was a precision instrument that could fire, move, and fire again, the Soviet response was a disaster of engineering. When the Soviets took the condensator to the testing grounds to fire a live round, the reality of physics crashed down on them. The gun was simply too big for the chassis. When they fired the first shot, the recoil force was so violent that it tore the vehicle apart. The gearbox of the tank chassis disintegrated. The mounting brackets sheared off. The entire vehicle was thrown backward several meters, digging trenches in the earth. The crew inside was concussed. They tried again with an even larger version, the 2B1 Oka, which had a 420mm barrel. The barrel was so long that the driver warned it would collapse under its own weight if they drove over a bump too fast. When they fired it, the recoil destroyed the drive sprockets and ripped the engine from its mounts. The American Atomic Annie could fire a nuclear shell every few minutes with pinpoint accuracy. The Soviet copy was a suicide machine that destroyed itself every time it fired. The reveal had backfired on the Soviets. They had rushed to copy a weapon they didn't understand, driven by the terror of the American deployment. The confrontation in the intelligence world was over. The Americans had won. They had fielded a weapon that worked, while the Soviets were parading massive, impractical metal tubes through Moscow just to keep up appearances. Western analysts eventually realized the truth. The condensator was a showpiece. It was scary to look at, but in a real war, it would have been a sitting duck, unable to move after its first shot. The M65 had achieved its purpose without ever firing a shot in anger. It had forced the Soviet Union to waste millions of rubles and thousands of man-hours chasing a technology they couldn't master. It forced them to realize that their massive tank armies, the pride of the revolution, were vulnerable to a single, well-placed shot from a gun they couldn't stop. The verdict on the atomic cannon saga can be summarized by a single, devastating comparison of operational reality. The American M65 was a functional weapon of war. It was deployed to Europe and South Korea. It was driven on public roads, set up in muddy fields, and drilled by crews until they could fire a nuclear round in under 15 minutes. It was a reliable, terrifying cog in the NATO defense machine. The Soviet response, the condensator and the Oka, were engineering catastrophes. They never entered service. They never deployed to a single tactical unit. They were built solely for the cameras in Red Square. The recoil from their massive barrels was so self-destructive that they required major repairs after almost every test shot. The scorecard was absolute. The United States had 20 fully operational atomic cannons holding the line in Europe. The Soviet Union had 0. This technological victory highlights the defining macro theme of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was often obsessed with the image of parity. They saw the American gun, panicked, and ordered their industry to build a bigger one, ignoring the underlying physics and engineering limitations. They prioritized the propaganda victory of the parade over the practical reality of the battlefield. The Americans, conversely, had solved the problem through innovation by rethinking the bomb design itself, rather than just making the hammer bigger. The legacy of Atomic Annie is not just in the metal, but in the silence. For nearly a decade, during the most volatile years of the Cold War, the Red Army did not cross the Fulda Gap. The massive tank formations that the West feared never poured into West Germany. There are many reasons for this, but the psychological weight of the M65 cannot be overstated. Soviet generals knew that their numerical advantage in tanks was meaningless if a single American artillery battery could delete a grid square. The Atomic Annie forced them to hesitate. It bought time. And in the nuclear age, time is the only commodity that matters. Eventually, technology marched on. By the early 1960s, rocket technology had improved. The United States developed the Little John and Honest John missiles, and eventually, nuclear artillery shells were miniaturized enough to fit into standard 155mm and 203mm howitzers. The massive M65 became obsolete, a dinosaur replaced by smaller, faster mammals. The Soviets too eventually found their footing with tactical missiles like the Scud and the Frog systems, moving away from their disastrous superguns. But the M65 remains a singular icon of a specific moment in history, a moment when the world was terrified of a phantom explosion in the desert, and the solution was a gun the size of a building. Today, the original Atomic Annie, the very gun that fired the shot in 1950, sits quietly at the United States Army Artillery Museum at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. It rests under the open sky, its paint fading slightly in the Sunday. Tourists walk past it, often without realizing what they are looking at. They see a big cannon. They do not see the weapon that once froze the Soviet Union in its tracks. They do not see the machine that turned the atomic bomb from a strategic abstraction into a tactical reality. It is a silent giant now, a relic of a time when the world balanced on a knife edge. And the difference between peace and Armageddon was measured in millimeters of steel.